Alright everyone, we have to do some midterm banter looking at some polling numbers. Now for the generic congressional ballot, it's still, there isn't enough polling there to get a full, I think, estimation of the true number. It's more sporadic. Trump's approval, we've got plenty of polling in any given period for that. Like there are 5 different polls every week. They've narrowed somewhat, like the numbers agree with one another more. When I see, by the way, when I see Rasmussen is down around the same areas, YouGov, Emerson, these others, that sort of defeats the concept that Rasmussen has been a consistent outlier. Maybe they're actually right. Maybe they and YouGov are the right numbers and Trump's approval is closer to 46 at the moment. And that this 44 number, or 43 that they're showing, represents a slight drop after the Putin summit stuff. It is possible, in which case Trump is well ahead of where he needs to be already. I think it's possible. I just don't think it's likely. I think that the number with Trump approval is around 43. That makes sense. You're going to see it, by the way, take a dip over the next few days, the next round of polling, reflecting more of that Trump-Putin summit fallout. Specifically, in the end of the summit, a lot of Republicans dogpiled him, as well as the Democrats, a lot of people in the intel agencies. He took a pounding. Now, it's an undeserved pounding. I mean, I have no problem with what he said. I actually think he's right, and I don't want a warmonger after Russia, but that's an unpopular opinion. Most Americans want a warmonger after the Russians and start a nuclear war. They agree with John McCain, including a majority of Republicans. Well, fucking so be it. I guess I'd better dig a bunker in the backyard. But looking just pragmatically at the numbers without any moral component or my own opinion, yeah, it makes sense. He's going to take a dip. He'll probably end up at 41. He might even end up in the high 30s for a short period of time. Now, that's short term, what we've seen. This has happened a million times with Trump. He takes a dip. People forget about the issue, he goes back up. Because his organic level of approval is around 42-43%. And rising. Slowly, but rising. When this sort of thing happens, all it does is slow down the regression to the long-term approval that I think he will naturally end up being at in a partisan climate, which is probably around 45-46%. That's where I see him. I think what's happening is the ceiling is lowering, the floor is rising. In a hyper-partisan climate, it's not all well. There are people who will never support him, so his ceiling is steadily declining towards some sub-50% approval level. Possibly, but the floor is rising, because some of those people are siding with him. I think his floor is probably around 35, below which he can't possibly fall unless he commits literal treason. Like if he were to wipe his ass with the U.S. Constitution on live TV, yeah, his approval would fall. Likewise, it probably can't get much above maybe 55 or 60% no matter how well he does. Like literally, he could literally, people have pointed this out, cure cancer, and people would say he was robbing the medical industry and putting doctors out of business. As far as the congressional ballot, it shows a deficit of around 7.5 to 8 points for Republicans. Again, though, there isn't enough current polling. We have to we need more polling. They need to conduct more polls of this. They need to conduct more polls. I want twice as many numbers before I can gauge whether it's accurate or not. But generally speaking, again, it's narrowed somewhat. It's between 7 and 10 deficit for Republicans. Now, this is nowhere near as good as they'd like it. They would like to go into the election ahead, or at least only a few points behind. They were within 3 points of the Democrats there for a while. If they can get back to that level, they easily win 2 or 3 Senate seats. They retain the House. If, however, they go in the other direction, for a while they were almost 20 points behind, they lose both. At the current level, they certainly, I would say, keep the Senate. The House, though, is more iffy. Their chances of retaining the House are still, in my estimation, above 50-50, but it's a lot closer. It's not like their odds of losing the Senate, which is like 1%, basically dream on. It's also tied to Trump's approval. We have to monitor his approval close. What I've said consistently is 45 is the magic number. If he's at or exceeded or very close to 45 on midterm election day, the Republicans retain the Senate, gain at least 1, probably 2 or 3 Senate seats, possibly 4, although it's a stretch, and they retain the House at least narrowly. If he's much below that, the main risk for them is they lose the House, not the Senate. The Senate's not really in play at this point. They're favored to retain the Senate even though they are 10 points behind almost in the generic ballot. So, it's probably going to move generally in a more favorable direction. What you're likely to see close to the end of the midterms is a narrowing in the generic ballot. You're also, again, likely to see a more narrowing of the polls, with regards to Trump's approval, with regards to each individual race as well. And pretty soon, come mid-August or so, we're going to get more polling from the individual races. We're going to have to pay attention to especially the Senate. I'm less interested in analyzing dozens of House races than basically a half a dozen Senate races that are going to formulate what happens over the next 2 years of our domestic policy within the U.S. Those are much more important, thankfully for the Republicans. The Senate looks a lot more rosy than the House does. They've got a higher chance of losing the House despite the fact that they're ahead by a much larger margin, because a lot of those, in the Senate, 2/3 of those races are happening in places that Trump won. That definitely helps them. Also, the Democrats have to defend far more seats. The Republicans are defending a couple vulnerable seats. The Democrats have 6 vulnerable seats that the Republicans could potentially gobble up. And it looks like at least one of those so-called vulnerable seats, isn't that Ted Cruz versus Beto O'Rourke? Ted Cruz is going to steamroll it. That's not really up for grabs. Ted Cruz will handily cruise to re-election. You don't even have to like Ted Cruz. I know I'm not exactly a fan of his anyway. He tried to become president while having been born in Canada. Yeah, that's a little bit of a no-go zone for me. And the butter cow is what tipped it, I think, against him, really, in the primaries. If it weren't for that damn butter cow that he fawned over, he would have won. He could have been President Cruz, and then quickly gotten kicked out of office for not technically being constitutionally able to hold that office. It would have been very, very funny indeed. But looking at the polling, still not great for Republicans at the moment. They need to start getting more hyped about voting. At the very least, Republican laypeople, the warning would be, if you suffer from anything other than stellar turnout with a 10-point gap in the congressional ballot, you lose the House. Turnout could save them, but I mean, wouldn't you rather be, just a few points behind or even drawn even? If it's even, if the Republicans are within 3 points, they prevail. They add Senate seats, they maintain the House, because turnout will be higher among Republicans. There is no central Democrat or central ethos other than we don't like Trump gluing the Democrats together, holding the party together, and getting them to vote. You've got to understand that neoliberals and progressives right now are at war within the Democratic Party. If the candidate, therefore, is a neoliberal, some of the younger voters that otherwise would help campaign won't be doing that. They'll say, fuck it, the Democrats have sold us out. Nationally, they may still like the Democratic Party more, but they're not going to turn out for the candidate. Not at high levels, anyway. The Republicans are congealed. There are cracks showing with regards to the Russian shit, but, this has all been calculated by the intel agencies to try to stop the Republicans in the midterms. Absolutely, and once that becomes more obvious, it'll become an election issue. It'll probably drive even higher. I think that it'll end up with backlash. It'll, basically explode in the faces of the deep state. I really mean that. That's what I would say I think will happen. I would say overall, the Republicans are still massively favored in the Senate, but looking at the numbers, they need to improve them. In some cases, that means that some Republicans might have to distance themselves from Trump. For the most part, at least in the Senate, though, they need to embrace him. They need to close rank with Trump more than anything, generally speaking. That's about all. Peace out.